All the people said, Amen. Thank you, Brother Ted, Brother Allen, and Brother Raul. Is that what he called you? Yeah, all right. I think I got that. So anyway, thank all of you for being here and for leading us, all the group here. We're very grateful. And thank you for allowing me to be here with you. It's been a great time. Enjoyed being back in this area. And I have good news. My wife said she slept all night last night for the first time since her surgery, knee surgery. So that was good to find out. We're glad to hear that. And she wanted you to know she was praying for us, and we're very, very grateful for that. She's my prayer warrior, and she's also my corrector. She's heard all my sermons. Every once in a while, I was interim pastor here a couple of years ago at a church out in Burleson, Texas, and she'd never heard the sermons because I did new sermons and preached through the book of Ephesians. But I used as an illustration Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Now you have to understand that when a preacher preaches, he's not only saying what he's saying, but he's thinking what he's about to say. And that it's a little complicated. I mean, you'd have to preach to understand that. But I always get Mary and Martha mixed up. So I'm waxing eloquent, and I talk about Jesus came to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and Mary was in the kitchen, and Martha was at the feet of Jesus. And Carolyn said, Mary was at the feet of Jesus, just blurted it out. And the crowd just went crazy. And so she said, I knew you were going to use that and say it several times, so I thought I'd just better go ahead and tell you. So she kind of keeps me straight. But I do want to talk to you tonight about you're at your 50th anniversary, and I'm happy to tell you the best is yet to come. And that's because of the God we serve, who, in spite of everything, is still in control. But He's given us an assignment. We talked about that last night. We who have received the water of life are not just to enjoy it, we're to share it and to give it to others. We're to be distributors of the water. And so that's our assignment. But how do you get ready for the future in a world like this? I mean, let me give you an illustration of what's happening in the world. In the year 1900, it was estimated that the knowledge of the world was doubling every 100 years. At the end of the Second World War, which would have been in 1945, it was not that bad. It had reduced to every 25 years. Do you know that today the knowledge of the world is doubling every 13 years? But the projection is, within just a few years, it will be doubling every 12 hours. Now think about that. A world that is gaining in knowledge that quickly. And there are many other reasons why we ought to be concerned about the future and how to deal with it. And I got to thinking about that and thought about all the things that are happening, changing in our world today. The knowledge is changing. But that's not all. During the years of the French Revolution, when it started, someone was overheard saying that this is a riot. And someone else wisely said, no, this is not a riot, it's a revolution. Now, we are living in a day where we're seeing a lot of riots. But I have to tell you, we're not really seeing riots, we're seeing a revolution. The world is changing in an incredible way. For instance, there's a population revolution. There's 7.5 billion people in the world today. Now, we can't even imagine a billion. Do you know if you went into business when Jesus was born and you had a capital investment of $1 billion and you lost $1,000 every day, as of today, you would still have nearly 800 years before you'd be bankrupt. That's 1 billion. There's 7.5 billion people in the world. There are over 500 cities in the world of more than 1 million people. we don't know most of their names. 154,000 people die every day in the world. That's 102 every minute. That's 6,100 every hour. Twice as many people are born every day as there are that die. There's a population revolution taking place, and truthfully, now hear me carefully, we're one generation away from extinction as believers. If we do not share, if we do not share the gospel we've received, will not be long till there will be no one preaching the gospel. There's a behavior revolution taking place. We're living in a world, in a nation and a world that is captivated by violence and hostility. From the years 2006 to 2016, there were 4,015 terrorist attacks worldwide. There were 401,305 people killed in those 11 years in terrorist attacks. 29 countries out of about 195 countries in the world are in civil war right now, and there are 253 conflicts between malicious, terrorist, and anarchist groups. In the United States, there are 47 murders every day, and violence costs us as taxpayers $1.7 trillion every year. That's $7,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. It's over $6 billion a day. This is a violent revolution taking place. And when I talk about revolution, let me go a step further to tell you, by revolution, I mean things are changing in these areas in a way that they will never be the same again. So we need to understand that. There's an economic revolution. We're in a global economy now. What happens in Asia or South America or Africa, wherever, impacts our own stock market. It's a global economic revolution, impacts every country in the world. It's a family revolution. We have the disintegration in America today of the American family. Over 50% of our children will live with a single parent by the time they're 18 years of age. Loneliness is now an American trademark. There are over 20 million adults who actually live alone. They're literally alone. There's a family revolution taking place. There's an emotional revolution taking place. There are 45,000 suicides every year in America. That's 125 every day. And there are twice as many suicides as there are homicides. And for every successful suicide, there are 25 people who try suicide and fail. I mean, this is the kind of emotional revolution that we're seeing. The emotional revolution has the world puzzled and crying out for help. There's a technological revolution take place. Do you know the technology that's sweeping the world? Just, you can name it, email, internet, LinkedIn, Plaxco, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. None of them are over 25 years old for public use. And yet, with email and with some of the others, they're almost half of the population of the world who are utilizing these technologies that have just been developed in the last 25 years. Technological revolution. There's a religious revolution taking place. Depending on who you talk to, last year one report said that 59% of Americans said that they were Christians. Some research will tell you maybe 70%. We do know this, that 25.4% of the religious beliefs that are identified in America are evangelical Christians. But 22.8% this last year reported they had no religion. So the second biggest religion in America today is not anything like Islam or Eastern mysticism or any of the isms that we run into, but nearly 23% of those who claim that they have no religion, which means they worship themselves. And they have their own God. That's in the religious world, and that's a revolution that is taking place. And there's a cultural revolution. When I grew up, some of you can remember this. I know it'll be hard. Maybe mine was more this way than yours if you grew up in a metropolitan area. I grew up in a small town. We never locked the doors, had no air conditioning, left keys in the car in the driveway. It was a quiet time. The church was the center of activity. Schools would not plan anything on Sunday or Wednesday because those are church nights. The most prominent man in the community was the Baptist pastor or the Methodist pastor, whoever the pastors might be in the city. That was less than 70 years ago. Lots changed. Lots changed. And now, not only is that not true, our own Homeland Security has declared in recent years that evangelical Christians are more dangerous than ISIS. And our faith, our Christian belief is mocked and ridiculed and attacked. And one of the precious liberties that you don't hear much about, but it's happening more and more every day, is that we're soon, in the direction we're going, we'll lose our religious liberty, our rights to gather like this without some kind of supervision or intervention. There's a cultural revolution taking place. All of these things make it harder for us to get ready for the future because we don't know what the future holds, do we? We have no way of understanding how all of this is going to play out. Now, when I was at Lifeway, we had a little thing we did, and you businessmen know the same thing. We used to do strategic planning. And some of you worked in the secular world know strategic planning. That was a big thing. But you see, strategic planning was based on the assumption that you had some ability to predict the future. You had some bar out there you measured everything by, and so you planned your strategies based upon what you anticipated for the future. Now, we can't do that today. Strategic planning is a great idea, but our world is changing so fast that we don't really know what the future holds. Now, having said that, the gospel never changes, does it? God was not surprised by the 21st century. He gave us everything we need in the Scripture to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The message never changes, but the method has to change. Do you think the Apostle Paul would not have used the internet or Facebook or Twitter or any of those things if he had it availability to him to have that? Well, of course he would have. He used every means. The thing that caused Christianity in the first century to spread so rapidly was that Rome had built a great system of roads. It literally spread around the world. Greek had been so dominant that the entire known world at that time, spoke Greek. And so you had a common language, you had roads, you had rivers and oceans that had passageway through boats to deliver goods. And so he used every means possible to declare the gospel that was given to him. Now, that same gospel has been entrusted to us. Now, how do we get ready for the future, knowing that the gospel doesn't change, but how we deliver it and how we communicate it has to change? Now, as I told you last night, I'm older than most of you, and we don't like change. But here's a secret. I hate to tell you this. You might want to write this down. Change is not optional. It's inevitable. Now, you can't stop it. And so, and now if you don't believe this, just go look in the mirror and then look at your high school picture. Or your wedding pictures. Hey, things change. We have no control over it. And so we have to face a world in turmoil, a world in revolution, with an unchanging gospel, but with the changes necessary to more effectively communicate the gospel. Now, I want you to take your Bibles, and let's see where I am. I'm in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. And let me see that. No, I'm sorry, it's Joshua 3. That's another sermon in Exodus 3. Joshua 3, I think where I am. Joshua chapter 3. Let me quickly tell you what the setting for this is. The children of Israel escaped from Egypt. You remember the miraculous deliverance from Egypt? The Red Sea parted. They crossed on dry land. The waters covered the armies of Pharaoh. They are now in the wilderness. And for 40 years, they traveled in the wilderness. I used to say, and probably do sometimes still, that they wandered in the wilderness, but that's really not true. God led them step by step in the wilderness. And so they were under the direct guidance of God in the wilderness. They had come once before to the land of promise down at Kadesh Barnea, which is down at the south of what is today the land of Israel. And you remember that's when they formed a committee? Now, I like committees, but someone said that a camel was a horse that was designed by a committee. And you know, so they set a committee, and it was an inspection committee. That committee went into the promised land. You may have a Bible in the map with maps in the back that has the inspection that those spies that went into Israel did. They went all the way up almost to Syria, and all the way up the Mediterranean into Lebanon, and by the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, turned around and came back. They did a good, thorough investigation. And when they came back, they said, you know, it's everything God said it was. Man, it is something else. I mean, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. But, now, be careful when you use the word but. He said, but there are giants in those cities. And notice what they said. We are like grasshoppers in our sight. See, they got their eyes off of God. And the people looked so big to them that they felt we're just grasshoppers. And so 9 or 10 of the 12 that went as spies said, we cannot take the land. It's everything God said, but we can't take it. 2, remember Joshua and Caleb said, we want to give a minority report. God said, to take it, let's go get it. It's ours. Let's go take it. But the people decided not to do that. And so they turned away from Kadesh Barnea. Now then, in this chapter, in chapter 3 of Joshua, they have come back to enter the promised land. This time, though, they didn't have a smooth entry they had at Kadesh Barnea. There weren't any rivers to cross. There were no mountains they had to climb. The land was easily traveled. But now they are facing several problems. One is the Jordan River is at flood stage. Every year in the spring when the snow melts and the rains come and the rivers fill the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River overflows its banks, and the Jordan Valley is very wide. And they are in flood stage, according to this 3rd chapter, toward the end of this chapter, said that it was the flood stage of the Jordan River. So they've got to cross a flooded Jordan River. Think of the women, children, aged, young, all ages. How are they going to get 1.5 million people across a river that's flooded and in a raging torrent? Now that's what they faced. So they're at that point when we come to chapter 3 here. So let me just read, beginning at verse 1. Joshua started early the next morning. They'd been camping up at the Acacia Grove with all the Israelites, and they went as far as the Jordan and stayed there before crossing. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God carried by the Levitical priests, you're to break camp and follow it. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards between yourselves and the ark. Don't go near to it so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. You see, if everybody crowded around the ark, wouldn't be very many of them get to see it. So let it get out there far enough for all of us to be able to see it. And then you follow the ark. because you haven't traveled this way before. Now, for us, our ark is Jesus. Now, our job is to keep our eyes on Jesus, because truthfully, we can say of every day, I haven't traveled this way before. Every day, we're traveling a new road. But Jesus knows the way, and we need to keep our eyes on Him. So Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, because the Lord will do wonders among you tomorrow. Then he said to the priests, carry the Ark of the Covenant, go on ahead of the people. So they carried the Ark of the Covenant, went ahead of them. Now look down in verse 15. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the waters flowing downstream stood still. They just stopped, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city near Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, Lord's covenant, stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Jordan crossed over on dry ground till the entire nation had finished crossing Jordan. Now notice the miracle. The waters just stopped, but it wasn't muddy. It was dry. So they crossed on dry ground. It was a miracle of God. Now this passage gives us 4 simple statements about how we get ready for the future. Now, I'm going to apologize to start with. This isn't rocket science. You will not misunderstand what I'm going to say. It's not complicated. It's not obscure. It's very clear. 4 things that we need to do today, just as the children of Israel did, if we're going to be ready for the future. Okay, number 1, don't dwell in the past. Do you notice he didn't say anything about the past? I think maybe if I was Joshua, I might have reminded them how rebellious they were not to go in at Kadesh Barnea. I think I might have scolded them and said, you know, we could have walked in without getting our feet wet. Here we got a raging river in front of it. He didn't even mention the past. Now, that's not surprising, because in the first chapter, in verse 2, God said to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross the Jordan to the land I'm giving to you. Wasn't very good bedside manners the Lord exercised. He just said, Moses is dead. He wasn't denigrating Moses. Moses is still highly revered and regarded and esteemed greatly. It wasn't that he was putting Moses down. He just, hey, Moses is gone. Now listen carefully to me. The past is over. It's not here anymore. It is not coming back. We could all wish that we could go back to a much simpler time, a time before television, a time where we listened to the radio, to Fibber McGee and Molly, or to Red Skelton, or the Shadow, or the Green Hornet, and the Lone Ranger. We just had radios. I was 15 years old before I ever saw a television set. We didn't have any television. We could listen to some radio programs. It was wonderful. We played games. Can you imagine? We made up games. Who of us hadn't played hide and seek and kicked the can and think you made up games? If you didn't know a game, you just make up a game, make up the rules. It was a simple time. We'll never go back to that. The changes in the world are so significant that what is happening to the world means it will never be the same again. And what it is today, it will not be next year. It will be much different. But we shouldn't live in the past because we can't go back there. Don't live in the past. The past ought to be a foundation for us to build upon. But it's not a museum for us to dwell in and to remember fondly and to cherish in an unhealthy way. It's just not going to be the same. Now we can either fuss about that and get upset every time there are changes, or we can make peace with it and realize that we have a gospel that never changes. But my grandmother came to Arkansas from South Carolina in a covered wagon. I don't think any of you arrived tonight in a covered wagon. I doubt if you resent the air-conditioned automobile that you came in. You know, we like some changes, don't we? Maybe it soothes us, comforts us. But the past is something for us to remember, but we don't live there. We don't live there anymore. And many people are trapped in the past. They're trapped in the experiences of the past. Something happened in the past. Someone did something to us, said something about us, whatever. Trapped in the past. And we can't get away from it. And let me illustrate it this way. Ron Dunn used to talk about the Indians in the northern, the natives, the Indian tribe in the northern part of this continent, the Inuit tribe. And they lived up there near the Arctic, and their prime meat was polar bear meat. And they would hunt bear, and they had an unusual way of hunting bears. They would find the path that the bear liked to travel on. They observed that, and then they would get themselves some whale blubber. Bears love whale blubber. And they would get a hunk of it, and then they would take a small bone of an animal and heat it and twist it till it was like a corkscrew, and they would work it into that whale blubber. And then they would put it out on the path where the bear loved to travel, and they just go over and watch. After a while, here comes Mr. Bear waddling down the path, and he sniffs something he liked, and there was the whale blubber, and he goes over and sniffs it. Sure enough, there it is. I mean, it's like cookies to a kid. I mean, he loved bear blubber and the whale blubber, and so he begins to eat that, and he chews on it, and he swallows that piece of whale blubber, and the minute he swallowed it, he has killed himself. Because as the acid of the stomach begins to dissolve and to remove the whale blubber in his stomach, that sharp bone is revealed. At every step he takes, that bone rips the interior of his stomach until he bleeds to death. And then he dies, and the folks up there have their bear. They didn't shoot him. They didn't trap him. They just gave him whale blubber, and he killed himself. Now, let me be very honest. If you're trapped in the past, you've been unable to forgive somebody, you've been unable to adjust to a changing world, you're still dwelling in the good old days, and you can't get looking forward but looking back, it's like you're like that polar bear. Every step you take is cutting the inside of your heart and soul and destroying you for the inability to move past what has happened in the past. Now, we have a very famous man down in Texas. His name is Wrong Way Willie. He's from Abilene. He's in the Guinness Book of Records. He's in the Guinness Book of Records for walking across America backwards. He strapped a rearview mirror to his head, and he looked in that rearview mirror, and he walked backwards all the way across America. Well, I want to tell you something. You can't go through life looking in the rearview mirror. You just can't do it. As much as we'd like to, we can't recapture it. It's like trying to hold water in your hand or sand in your hand. It's gone. It's quicksilver. Don't live in the past. It's wonderful. Thank God for the past. We all have wonderful memories of the past. Boy, I have so many wonderful memories. I started preaching when I was 14 years old. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I was preaching revivals in Houston, Texas. My song leader was a young man named Chuck Swindoll. You might have heard Chuck. If you've been on the radio, listened to Christian speakers, you might know who he is. We went to high school together. He was a member of our church. He was a year ahead of me. He graduated in 1952. His dad had a sheet metal shop in his garage in Pecan Park down in Houston. And I was a senior. And he'd go to work every morning with his dad. I'd go to school. And he'd get through and shower and clean up. And I'd come home from school, change clothes, shower, get ready. I'd meet him out at a church. We did 22 revivals. It was incredible. The Lord was just amazing. Pastors of large churches literally had 17, 18-year-olds leading their church in revival for a week. That's amazing. I never did that while I was pastor. I mean, turn things over to a 17-year-old, 18-year-old. But God was all over it. Hundreds and hundreds got saved. In fact, so many were getting saved that both principals of the two high schools in our end of town, Austin and Milby High Schools, because we were all over that area, called us to the office. We went to the principal's office to say, please don't close down your revival wherever we were preaching, because we're making such an impact on our school. It was a wonderful time. I'd love to go back to that. I remember the first time I preached a message and nobody responded to the invitation. I was shocked. It had never occurred to me that I would preach and give an invitation, nobody would come forward. And it was those were incredible days. I cherish those days. I love the time that Chuck and I had across Houston. But I don't want to go back there. It's not there anymore. It's gone. The past, as wonderful as it may have been, is just not there. And so the way that you get ready for the future is don't dwell in the past. We're all getting older. Told you last night, the secret as you get older is don't get old. Old is a frame of mind. Satchel Paige pitched in the major leagues till he was nearly 60 years old. He didn't know how old he was. I mean, he had no birth certificate. And he's the one who said, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you are? You see, age is a matter of the mind. And so, you're going to get older. You just don't have to get old. Don't live in the past. As wonderful as the history of this church is, as wonderful as the things you may have had over many years in your life, it's just not there anymore. So don't dwell on that. Thank God for it. Praise God for it. Build upon it. We're the product of people who took time to pour their lives into us. And so somebody cared about us, poured their lives into us. And every one of us is here and we are what we are today because somebody poured themselves into our lives. But don't live there. Be grateful for the past, but don't dwell in the past. Second thing is don't worry about the future. Now he says here that you're to consecrate yourselves because the Lord will do wonders among you tomorrow. Now I don't know what he was talking about. I guess maybe he's talking about the conquest of Jericho, which took place a couple of days later. But the point he's making is don't worry about the future. God's already been there. Do you understand that? God looks at our lives and he sees it completely. From our birth to our death. He wrote our history before we were ever born. So he knows what's going to happen to us. And so we can trust him. I don't know when I will die. This may be the last sermon I ever preach. You may say, well, I hope so. No, don't do that. But, we don't know. But here's the truth. I may die in an accident, but I'll never die accidentally. Because our lives are in the hands of God, and we can trust him. He takes care of his own. I don't know the mystery of life and death and why one is taken away at this age or another at that. I don't understand all that, but I do know this, that God is with us until it's time for us to leave, and once it's time for us to leave, we're going. I love preaching in prisons. We had a team that went into prisons down in Huntsville, Texas, into the death row prison, Ellis unit down out of Huntsville. And I'll never forget one song that the singing group sang. It's called Just Call Me Gone. And the essence of it was that thus and thus and thus is going to happen. The Lord's going to come. When the trumpet sounds, just call me gone. I mean, and the prisoners loved it. And we need to realize God's going to take care of the future. And when it's our time, just call me gone. I can't stop it, can't extend it. God is sovereign. But we don't worry about tomorrow. It's a lack of faith. Worry is unbelief. It's accusing God of messing up and failing us. We can't do that. Don't spend any time fretting about tomorrow. You got enough on your hands today. You got enough challenges today. Now, don't borrow challenges from tomorrow, because they'll be there. And I think when Jesus said that sufficient for the day is the evil thereof, there'll be enough problems today, and there will be tomorrow, so don't worry about tomorrow. God's still in control. So we don't dwell in the past, and we don't worry about the future. Third thing, don't miss today. I know you weren't paying attention. I can tell. Maybe Rob was. I mean, he's nodding in the eye. He may have caught it. I doubt if Fred did. But if you weren't paying attention, you didn't notice that after they were told that they should consecrate themselves because God was going to do wonders tomorrow, they crossed the Jordan that day. Wasn't some other day. It was that day. I mean, they weren't so wrapped up in the failures and the successes of the past or worrying about the future. They crossed the Jordan that day. And what I'm telling you is, this is the only time you have. You don't have yesterday. You don't have tomorrow. You have right now. That's all you have. And don't miss today. Don't miss what God's saying today. Don't fail to heed His voice today. If you're going to be ready for the future, you need to be obedient today, because that's what He expects of all of us. Don't dare miss today. Then the last thing is, don't fail to prepare. Don't fail to prepare. Be ready when the time comes. He told the people, and here's the word He used, consecrate yourselves. This is the final step. This is getting ready. This is preparing for whatever the future holds and for whatever God has in mind. Consecrate yourselves. Now, pay attention here just a minute. The word consecrate is a word which means set yourself apart for God's use. Now listen carefully. God will not do that for you. You have to do it yourself. God will use you in spite of you, and I believe earnestly that none of us deserve to be used of God, and He doesn't use any of us because of us. It's always in spite of us, and God uses us in many ways. But if we're going to be prepared for the tomorrow God has in store for us, we're going to have to be consecrated, set apart for God's use. It's a word about holiness. It's a word about purity of life. It's a word about pure morality. It is a word that God simply says, I am holy and I want you to be holy like I am. And how can I be holy like God is? By setting myself apart for God's use. I told you last night, my wife and I have been married 62 years. We probably shouldn't have made it, because she was a junior in high school when I met her, and I was a junior in college. I was leading singing in a revival, and she was in the choir. I had preached all summer, every week, all summer long, except the third week in August. And long story, but they needed a singer, and so they never heard me sing, didn't know if I could carry a note, lead a song, or anything. They asked me to come lead singing in a revival in her home church. First Baptist Church, Lake Jackson, Texas. Strong church, one of the best churches in the country. So I went down there, met Carol Ann, and pastor, who was new, said, there's a young lady in our youth group, and I don't know her very well, and I'm new, said, I'd like for you to check her out. Said she's quiet, but she's a leader, and check her out and let me know what you think. Well, I understand now that he was playing Cupid. But Carol Ann and I visited together that week. I bought my first car that week over in Anahuac, Texas, across the bay from Galveston, and had a friend that had bought a car dealership over there. So my first car, it was a stick shift, vacuum shift, Chevrolet 4-door, without air conditioning or radio, and I paid $500 for it. Boy, I was doing great. So I went over there one morning early and picked up that car and came back, and Carol Ann helped me wash the car. Now, the story can get too complicated, and I don't want to let it get that way, but we named the car. And I could tell you the story of why we used that name, but that would take too much time. Besides that, it's none of your business. So anyway. But anyway, we named the car Herschel. And so when I'd come down, well, anyway, when the revival was over, her mother came by and said, Jimmy said, we've been so happy to have you here in our church. I said, Miss Floyd, you have not seen the last of me yet. And it kind of shocked her, I guess. But I started coming down when I could. I was still preaching on the weekends a lot, but when I could, I'd drive 250 miles from Waco down to Lake Jackson. And Carol Ann would go to school, I'd go to college. And we wrote letters. And we met on August the 20th, 1955. I bought her a ring Thanksgiving, gave it to her Christmas. And we married in July, 6 weeks after she graduated from high school. We didn't have any seminars on how to be married or how to do all the, you can get all kind of training now to be married. We had none of that. All we knew was that we loved the Lord and we loved His Word, and He wanted us to get married. That's been 62 years ago, and it's been a great journey. But in the spring, before we married, her mother and daddy wisely thought, well, if they're going to get married, they probably ought to be together as much as they could. So they brought her to Waco. And they had friends up there, so they brought her to Waco, and she stayed in the dorm with one of her friends. And they had friends, and they stayed and visited with them. So they came up Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We spent those 3 days together in March before we married in July. Now, we were sitting in a little white frame house on the west side of Waco, Texas, listening to records. Now, for you young people, records are round things with a hole in the middle here, Anyway, we listened to records. I mean, we kids, we just like they do today. We were listening to Frank Sinatra. He was a crooner. Oh, we loved to listen to Frank Sinatra, and he had a great song called "You Are My Everything." And I won't sing it for you, but as we were listening to Frank Sinatra sing "You Are My Everything," both of us realized that we had kind of pushed God out of the way in our courtship, and we'd wrapped our lives up in each other. So we got down on our knees beside an old couch in that little home, and we prayed a prayer like this. Lord, something happens to Carol Ann, I'm going to keep preaching. Whatever you want me to do, I'm yours. She prayed, Lord, something happens to Jimmy, I'm going to keep serving you. She was a mission volunteer, and I'm going to keep serving you. And then together, we prayed actual words, Lord, from now and for the rest of our lives, our answer is yes. Whatever that means. Whatever you want us to do. Wherever you want us to go. Whatever you want us to say. Our answer is yes. We're not going to debate you. We're not going to negotiate with you. We just want you to know that the answer is yes. Now, we made a lot of mistakes. As we all have. But I don't believe we ever made a mistake in where we served in these 62 years. Because we had promised God that if He'd just show us what He wanted us to do, we'd do it. So we'd already made that decision. And when I went to the Sunday school board, I was 55 years old. I had never been anything but a pastor. I had never had economics or any advanced math, any business training. All I'd ever done was been a pastor. Never was educational director, never was minister of music in a church. I'd just been pastor. We pastored some strong churches. We had one church that had about a $6 million budget, so had some experience with lots of funds, but had no business experience. And all of a sudden, we were asked to come to the Sunday school board, now Lifeway. The president had been telling the employees for several years that the Sunday school board was a dying organization. And they were losing. They had not had any increases in revenues other than price increases in 15 years. And here I was asked to be president of that organization without any training. The prospects of me succeeding were from slim to none, because I just was not the one to do it, except it's what God told us to do. And even though we probably, you don't change careers at age 55. It'd be a mistake if you're changing careers completely. You might go in the same area of business and, progress at that, but we had already told God yes. And I believe with all my heart that every move we made was the right move, because we'd already said yes to God. Now, I tell you all of that to say, there is one easy way for you to get ready for the future. Get on your knees and say to God, Lord, my answer is yes. Whatever that means. Whatever you want me to do, I'll be what you want me to be. I won't argue with you, debate, negotiate. I'll just obey. For now, for the rest of my life, my answer is yes. That takes care of all of it. You won't be dwelling in the past. You won't be worrying about the future. You won't miss today. And you'll be prepared for whatever God has in store. And I can promise you this, if you're obedient, if you say yes to Him, what happens in the days ahead will be the very best days of your life and of your church, because that's how you get ready for the future. If you pray with me, every head bowed just for a moment. We're going to have a time of invitation. We're going to ask that as God speaks to you, that you respond to His call. And specifically, I would like to ask you to do what Carol Ann and I did over 62 years ago. And just say, Lord, my answer is yes. Whatever that means, my answer is yes. I'll do whatever you want me to do. All you have to do is show me what you want me to do. And if you as a church do that, you tap in to the provision and the power and the strength and the sufficiency of God Himself, because you'll be obedient to what He calls you to do. And every one of us, that's something different, because no two of us are alike. God's call is tailor-made for us, and He has a perfect plan for your life, and He'll be with you every step of the way if you say yes to Him. And that's what I'm asking you to do tonight. Just say yes to Him. Father, thank you that though the future is uncertain, and so conditions and the revolution in the world today is such that things will never be the same again, we know you never change. We know your word is sufficient for every generation. We know your will is perfect, and that you will guide us with the plan you have for each of our lives. Our part's to be obedient. And Lord, a sign of Christian maturity is that we commit to do something even before we know what it is, because we say yes to you now. And Lord, that's our answer to whatever you ask us to do in the days ahead. So I pray, Father, that each of us will have that prayer tonight. Lord, my answer is yes. Whatever that means for today, for the rest of my life, my answer is yes. May that be true, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.